What if I told you that one of the greatest unsolved mysteries in human history isn't something we need to decode or reassemble in a laboratory? What if it's something we've been walking past, ignoring, treating as background noise for centuries? Something so obvious that archaeologists, engineers, and historians have completely missed the most disturbing answer, staring them right in the face. Today, we're not talking about mechanisms or weapons. We're talking about the technology that built civilization itself, and the shocking truth about who really understood stone. When we talk about ancient technologies we can't explain, everyone jumps to the Antikythera mechanisms, the bronze computer. Everyone marvels at the intricate gears and the astronomical calculations encoded in metal. But they're asking the wrong question. They're looking at the evidence backward. The real mystery isn't how the ancients built these rare, precious artifacts. The real mystery is something far more unsettling. How did they move, cut, and place stones with a level of precision that makes modern engineers weep? Consider this. The Great Pyramid of Giza contains 2 million stone blocks. The average weight of each block is 2.5 tons. Some weigh as much as 15 tons, and yet, when archaeologists measure the gaps between these stones, gaps that have survived 4,500 years of earthquakes, erosion, and the weight of millions of tons of stone pressing down from above, find tolerances measured in millimeters. In some cases, fractions of millimeters. A piece of papyrus cannot slide between the joints. You cannot fit a human hair. We're talking about stones that were cut and placed with precision that rivals modern laser-guided machinery. And this wasn't done once. It was done hundreds of thousands of times, in scorching heat, with copper tools, according to mainstream archaeology. But here's where it gets darker. Here's where the official narrative breaks down completely. Because archaeologists and historians have found evidence that absolutely contradicts the mainstream story about how these pyramids were built, and they've been quietly arguing about it for decades, while documentaries and textbooks continue to peddle the accepted version as if the contradictions don't exist. Let me walk you through what we know. In the 1970s and 1980s, Egyptologists discovered evidence of what they called construction ramps, the theoretical pathways that laborers would have used to drag these massive stones into place. The problem? The ramps they theorized would have had to be larger than the pyramids themselves. They would have required more material and labor than building the actual structure, and no archaeological evidence of these ramps has ever been found. Not one convincing trace. Not a single quarry site with the right distribution of remains. Not tool marks on stones that match the official narrative. Nothing. In 2007, a team of French engineers ran the numbers. They calculated exactly how many workers, moving stones on wooden sledges, would have been needed to build the Great Pyramid in the accepted 20-year time frame. The answer was staggering. Between 105 and 160 Uzo workers, full-time, for 20 years. That's not a workforce. That's a slave army the size of a major civilization. And there's no evidence they ever existed. No skeletal remains in mass graves. No settlement sites that could have housed and fed this population. No ancient administrative records documenting their recruitment, logistics, or deaths. Nothing. Yet Egyptologists continue to assert this was possible. When the math doesn't work, they say the workers were more efficient. When evidence doesn't appear, they say it was destroyed by time. When alternatives are proposed, they dismiss them out of hand as pseudoscience. What if the reason the evidence doesn't exist is because it never happened that way? Now, here's what the Throne of Horrors actually investigates. What if the technology that built these structures wasn't lost? What if it was deliberately hidden? What if those who understood it took that knowledge with them to the grave, creating a mystery that would haunt humanity for millennia? Ancient Egypt left us writings, hieroglyphics, instructions for the afterlife, mathematical papyri, religious texts. Nowhere, and I mean nowhere, do we find a single instruction manual for how to cut, move, or place these stones with such precision. Technical drawings, no diagrams, no measurements. For a civilization that left us recipes for bread and lists of livestock, we find absolutely nothing about the most significant engineering achievement they ever accomplished. How is that possible? What kind of society builds the largest structures on the planet but leaves no record of the method. Some archaeologists have suggested that the knowledge was oral, passed from master to apprentice, never written down. But that creates an even darker problem. Because if the technique was truly oral knowledge, held only by a specialized caste of engineers, then what happened to them? Did they all die at once? Did their entire lineage vanish? Because after the pyramids were built, after these structures had been perfected to an impossible degree, the technology was never used again. The pyramids got smaller, precision diminished. The level of sophistication dropped dramatically with each successive dynasty. If the engineers and their knowledge still existed, why would they suddenly abandon their expertise and build inferior monuments? Unless they were eliminated. Unless that knowledge was considered so dangerous that it had to be suppressed. Unless there was a deliberate decision made to erase these people and their methods from history. Consider the anomalies that mainstream archaeology refuses to adequately explain. There are ancient stone structures in Peru, Pumapunku, Sacsayhuaman, where stones are cut and fitted with the same impossible precision. Different continent, different culture, different era, the same technology, the same mathematical perfection, the same complete absence of any explanation for how it was done. How did two completely unrelated civilizations, separated by thousands of miles and centuries of time, independently develop the exact same ultra-precise stone working technique, and then, mysteriously, both of them stopped using it? One civilization forgetting a technique is unlikely. Two civilizations forgetting it independently is a statistical impossibility, unless it wasn't forgotten, unless it was hidden. Here's the part that keeps me awake at night. We live in a world where we can simulate technologies we've never seen. We can decode alien mathematics. We can reconstruct extinct languages. We have artificial intelligence that can generate entire conversations based on fragments of text. And yet, when it comes to ancient stone construction, we sit here and say we don't know. They probably used ramps and slave labor. We refuse to investigate the alternatives seriously. We refuse to consider that the technology might have been something we don't yet have. Terminology 4. We refuse to admit that perhaps we don't have the full story. There's a resource that goes much deeper into the alternative theories and the evidence that mainstream archaeology actively ignores. I've got that linked in the description and pinned in the comments if you want to explore this rabbit hole further. But the deepest mystery isn't the technology itself. It's what comes after. Because once these structures were built, once they had achieved this impossible level of perfection, they became tombs, sealed chambers, places of death, not creation, as if the structures themselves were warnings, as if whoever built them was trying to communicate something to future generations, as if they were saying, "We were here. We knew something you'll never understand, and we buried it with ourselves." The real horror isn't that we can't explain ancient technology. The horror is that we've decided to stop trying. We've convinced ourselves that we have the answer, and that answer is simple labor and time. But the evidence tells a completely different story. A story about precision that shouldn't exist. About knowledge that vanished without explanation. About civilizations that achieved something we still cannot replicate, and then deliberately erase the memory of how they did it. That's not history. That's a cover-up. And it's been going on for over 4,000 years. But here's where it gets darker. Because the suppression of this knowledge wasn't accidental. It was methodical, deliberate. Throughout history, whenever a civilization rose to prominence and achieved technological marvels that should have been impossible, something happened. The knowledge vanished. The records were destroyed. The craftsmen were silenced. And those who came after were left staring at the ruins, inventing increasingly ridiculous explanations rather than admitting the truth. We don't know how they did this, and we might never know. The Library of Alexandria wasn't just a building. It was the repository of nearly 2,000 years of accumulated technological secrets. When it burned, and historians still debate whether it was deliberate or accidental, we didn't just lose books. We lost the instructions, the blueprints, the formulas that would have explained how the ancients accomplished what we see today. Think about that for a moment. Somewhere in those scrolls was possibly the answer to how the Great Pyramid was built with such astronomical precision. how the Antikythera mechanism was engineered, how civilizations mapped continents that shouldn't have been mapped yet. All of it went up in smoke. And it wasn't just Alexandria. The House of Wisdom in Baghdad suffered the same fate during the Mongol invasions. Libraries in Timbuktu were systematically destroyed. The Spanish conquistadors burned thousands of Mayan codices. Entire repositories of knowledge were erased from existence, sometimes by accident, sometimes by design. But the pattern is unmistakable. For a culture achieved something remarkable. Whenever they developed technology that defied explanation, that knowledge had an expiration date, it was going to disappear one way or another. What makes this even more sinister is the role that religious institutions played in this suppression. The Catholic Church, the Islamic caliphates, Hindu temples. They all had access to ancient texts and knowledge that contradicted their theological narratives. And what did they do? They edited the narrative. They kept the texts that aligned with their worldview and discarded, or worse, buried, the ones that didn't. A scholar would discover evidence of advanced mathematics in an ancient text, but if it suggested that human knowledge had declined rather than progressed in a straight line, contradicted the doctrine of inevitable progress. So it got reframed, downplayed, eventually forgotten. The Dark Ages aren't called the Dark Ages because we don't have written records. We call them the Dark Ages because we lost something. Knowledge regressed. Technology disappeared. Civilizations that had achieved remarkable things suddenly couldn't explain how those things were built. The Romans could build aqueducts that supplied water to cities of 1 million people. Then Rome fell, and for nearly 1,000 years, nobody in Europe could match that feat. Not because they didn't try, not because they weren't intelligent, because the knowledge of how to do it had been lost. This is the real horror story of human civilization. Not that we were once more advanced than we thought, but that we deliberately erased the memory of that advancement. We convinced ourselves it never happened. We invented new explanations to justify why these structures existed. Supernatural intervention, alien visitation, pure, dumb luck. Anything except the uncomfortable truth that we had lost something precious and irreplaceable. Consider the Nazca lines. For over 1,500 years, these massive geoglyphs remained unknown to the outside world because nobody bothered to fly over Peru and look down. The Nazca people created them sometime between 500 BC and 500 AD. They span an area of nearly 900 square kilometers. Some of the designs are so massive, over 200 meters long, that they're only visible from the air. How did they create perfect geometric designs that they could never actually see? How did they plan them? How did they ensure accuracy without modern surveying equipment? And here's the kicker. They did this in an extremely harsh desert environment, where a single mistake would waste enormous amounts of resources. Modern archaeologists propose they were made for religious ceremonies or as messages to the gods, as if that explains how they managed to create geometric shapes without the ability to see them from above. It doesn't. It's the same cop-out we use for every ancient achievement we can't explain. We assign a religious or ceremonial purpose and call it solved. Problem solved. Move on. Don't ask uncomfortable questions. The truth is that some of these achievements required knowledge we don't currently possess. Not impossible knowledge, not mystical or supernatural knowledge, just knowledge that we've lost. Knowledge about acoustics, about materials science, about engineering principles that were discovered empirically over generations and then forgotten when the civilizations that maintained that knowledge collapsed. Take stone cutting, for instance. The blocks used in the Great Pyramid are so precisely cut that you cannot fit a human hair between them. Not some of them, most of them. The precision is absolutely consistent. And they did this with copper tools, according to mainstream archaeology. Copper is softer than the limestone and granite they were cutting. Attempting to cut granite with copper would be like trying to cut steel with It doesn't work, not at that scale, not with that consistency, yet the evidence is right there. Millions of tons of precisely cut stone, fitted together with mathematical accuracy. Archaeologists and engineers have attempted to replicate pyramid construction using the methods believe the ancient Egyptians used. Every single attempt has failed. Not failed in the sense of, well, it took a long time. Failed in the sense of, we cannot achieve this precision, this speed, or this consistency using the proposed methods. Yet the Egyptians did it. Not once. Multiple times. With the largest pyramid containing approximately 2.3 million blocks of stone. This is where the narrative gets rewritten. When experiments fail to replicate ancient achievements, we don't ask, what are we missing? Instead, we ask, how can we reinterpret the evidence to fit our current understanding? And that's a fundamentally flawed approach to archaeology and history. It's not evidence-based, it's narrative-based. We've decided what the answer is: simple labor, unlimited time, and nothing more. And now we're forcing the evidence to fit that answer, regardless of how it actually looks. The Incans faced a similar problem. They built Pichu and other structures in the Andes Mountains using stone blocks that fit so tightly no mortar was needed. And unlike the pyramids, which were built in relatively flat terrain, the Incans had to contend with earthquakes. Their structures had to be flexible enough to move with seismic activity while maintaining their integrity. The engineering required to accomplish this is extraordinary. The Incans had no written language, no wheeled vehicles for transport, and no metal tools capable of cutting the stone they used. And yet, they built structures that have survived earthquakes that would have leveled modern buildings. We know the Incans built these structures because we can see them. How they moved multi-ton stone blocks up a mountain without the wheel, without metal tools, without documented engineering knowledge. That's where the narrative breaks down. We assign it to religious significance or ritual importance, again, as if that explains the mechanism rather than the motivation. Pyramid isn't impressive because it's a tomb. A tomb is just a function. A pyramid is impressive because of how it was built, and that's the part we still can't explain. This knowledge loss isn't limited to structural engineering. It extends to metallurgy, astronomy, mathematics, and medicine. The Baghdad battery is a terracotta jar filled with copper and iron that creates an electrical charge when filled with an electrolytic solution. It dates back to the Parthian Empire, roughly 2,000 years ago. We don't know what it was used for. It clearly demonstrates that ancient civilizations understood electrochemistry. Yet no other evidence of electrical technology exists from that period. No light bulbs, no wiring, no electrical devices besides this anomaly, which means either they had a limited use for electricity that we don't understand, or the knowledge was lost before it could develop further. Trepanation is another example. Archaeological evidence shows that humans were performing successful skull surgery, opening the cranium and removing bone thousands of years ago. We have skulls with healed trepanation sites, meaning the patient survived the procedure. Some skulls show multiple instances of trepanation, suggesting patients recovered and had the surgery performed more than once. In the ancient world, without anesthesia, without antibiotics, without modern surgical knowledge, the survival rate for ancient trepanation appears to have been shockingly high. Some estimates suggest up to 80% of patients survived the initial surgery. Modern surgeons are baffled by how this was accomplished. We have better tools, we have anesthesia, we have antibiotics, and yet, our survival rates aren't proportionally better than theirs were. This suggests that ancient healers possessed knowledge of anesthesia or pain management that we've lost. They understood how to prevent infection or manage it in ways we don't currently understand. They had surgical techniques and anatomical knowledge that shouldn't have been possible without the scientific method and the microscope. And yet, the evidence is right there. Skulls with perfectly healed surgical sites dating back 7,000 years. We've decided that ancient civilizations were simple, primitive, lacking in sophistication. And when we encounter evidence that contradicts this narrative, we explain it away. We invoke religious significance or ritual importance, suppose they were accidents or trial and error achievements. We do anything except admit that we don't understand, and that maybe, just maybe, they knew something we've forgotten. The suppression of knowledge isn't new. It's been happening for millennia, and the saddest part is that we're complicit in it. We've internalized the narrative so completely that we police ourselves. We dismiss evidence that doesn't fit. We ridicule researchers who ask uncomfortable questions. We've created an academic and archaeological consensus that's so rigid, so committed to a particular narrative, that alternative explanations are treated as heresy rather than investigation. But here's what keeps me awake at night. We have physical evidence. Not theories, not speculation, actual artifacts, bones, stones, tools, metal objects that shouldn't exist in their respective time periods. Archaeological finds that don't fit the timeline we've constructed. And instead of investigating them with genuine scientific curiosity, we've built an entire system designed to protect the narrative rather than challenge it. The Antikythera mechanism didn't fit our story about ancient Greece, so for decades it was treated as an anomaly, a one-off miracle. We didn't ask how many others existed. We didn't explore whether this represented an entire lost technological civilization. We simply quarantined it in our minds as an exception that proved the rule. And that rule was, ancient people were less capable than we are. Consider the trepanned skulls. Here we have direct evidence of advanced surgical knowledge, spanning thousands of years, across multiple continents, with survival rates that modern medicine would struggle to replicate. And what do we call it? A religious practice, a ritual, a curiosity. We've taken something genuinely astounding. The fact that ancient surgeons understood enough about the human skull, the brain beneath it, and the principles of infection control to regularly perform cranial surgery on living people. And we've reduced it to primitive spiritualism. Why? Because acknowledging the reality of that skill would require us to ask uncomfortable questions. It would force us to consider that perhaps ancestors weren't clawing their way up from primitive beginnings. Perhaps they had knowledge systems that were different from ours. More specialized, more focused on specific domains, less concerned with the kind of industrial, mechanized thinking we associate with progress. And that terrifies us, doesn't it? Because if they knew something about surgery, what else might they have known? What other domains of knowledge have we dismissed as primitive or magical because they didn't conform to our scientific method? What if there were entire branches of learning that we've simply forgotten, not because they were destroyed, but because we chose not to see them? The darkest part of this story isn't what the ancients knew or didn't know. It's what we've chosen to ignore. It's the deliberate suppression of evidence that doesn't fit our narrative. It's the academic consensus that functions more like a prison than a pursuit of truth. It's the way we've built a system where questioning the fundamental assumptions about human development is treated as intellectual heresy. The real horror isn't that ancient civilizations possess technology we can't explain. The real horror is that we live in an age where that evidence can be suppressed, marginalized, simply ignored because it contradicts what we've decided to believe. We have every tool at our disposal to investigate these mysteries with genuine scientific rigor. But instead, we've chosen conformity. We've chosen the comfortable narrative. We've chosen to remain ignorant. And the civilizations that came before us, they're paying the price for our choices. Their achievements are reduced to mysteries. Their knowledge is labeled as myth. Their innovations are explained away as luck, or accident, or religious fervor. We've constructed a historical narrative so narrow, so rigid, so committed to the idea of linear human progress, that there's no room for the possibility that we've forgotten something essential. The question isn't whether ancient people were intelligent. The evidence screams that they were. The question is, what made us decide they weren't? What psychological need did the narrative of primitive ancestors fulfill? And more importantly, what are we losing by refusing to see the truth that's staring us directly in the face? The suppression of historical truth isn't always violent. It's not always deliberate in the way we understand conspiracy. Sometimes it's just the weight of collective assumption, the burden of established belief, the gravity of consensus pulling everything back toward the accepted narrative. And that might be the most insidious suppression of all, because no one has to actively fight against it. It simply exists, a force as natural and invisible as the air we breathe. But we have a choice. We can accept the narrative we've been given, or we can look at the evidence with fresh eyes. We can ask uncomfortable questions. We can challenge the consensus. We can admit that we don't understand. And in that admission, we can find the beginning of genuine understanding. The horrors of human history aren't confined to the tyrants and the wars and the suffering. Sometimes the greatest horror is the silencing of truth, the erasure of knowledge, the deliberate forgetting of what came before. And as we stand in the wreckage of ancient civilizations, surrounded by the evidence of their achievements, we have to ask ourselves, are we really building a better world? Or are we just getting better at explaining away what we can't understand? The answers are out there. The evidence exists. Question is whether we have the courage to look at it, really look at it, without the filter of established belief. There's a comprehensive breakdown diving much deeper into the suppression of ancient knowledge available in the description and pinned comment. If you want to explore this rabbit hole further, you'll find everything there. Because here's the truth. History isn't written by the past. History is written by the present. And if we're writing it wrong, if we're choosing convenience over truth, if we're building an academic system that punishes curiosity and rewards conformity, then we're not discovering our past. We're inventing it. And we're doing it on purpose. The next time you encounter something that doesn't fit the narrative, something that seems impossible, something that contradicts what you've been told about how ancient people lived and thought and built and knew, don't dismiss it. Don't explain it away. Don't let consensus pull you back toward comfortable belief. Question it. Investigate it. Ask yourself why we've decided it's impossible. The darkness of human history includes our own willingness to remain blind to uncomfortable truths. And that, more than any ancient mystery, is what keeps the real scholars awake at night. Purpose. Make sure you check the channel description for an even deeper dive into the evidence that's being suppressed. Everything you need to understand just how far this goes is there waiting for you. If you want to stay updated on the darkest corners of history that others refuse to explore, subscribe now and turn on those notifications. New horrors are uploaded every week, and I'd hate for you to miss the truth that's hiding in plain sight. Thank you for descending into the darkness with me today. I'll see you in the next one.